There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. It was mid-2016 when 28-year-old Angela J downloaded Tinder. A doctor based in Port Macquarie, Angela had come out of a long-term relationship and had decided it was time to start dating again. That's when she came across the profile of a man named Paul Lambert. He had used the super-like feature on her, which meant he was especially interested in striking up a conversation. He had dark hair, friendly eyes, and a wide, warm smile, with dimples on either side. Conventionally attractive, Angela decided to reply to the 36-year-old and quickly learned they had a lot in common. Their first date was everything she wanted it to be. He was kind and interested, unashamed about how much he liked her. She couldn't have known at that point who he really was and the behaviours that lay in his past. Then came the gut feeling. Something wasn't right. It would end with every woman's worst nightmare. A story that made national news and an event that Angela will remember for the rest of her life.
This CCTV is of her ex-boyfriend Paul Lambert buying knives, a hatchet and duct tape in the days before he broke into her Port Macquarie home and hid in a wardrobe. When Dr. J entered the room, he grabbed her, stabbed her 11 times and doused her in petrol.
I'm Jessie Stevens and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Angela J. An outspoken survivor of intimate partner violence, Angela is also an advocate for White Ribbon Australia. You were 28 when you met a guy on Tinder. What were you looking for at the time in terms of a potential romantic partner?
At the time, I had separated from my ex-husband about 6 months to a year prior, and I had moved to Port Macquarie for work. As a junior doctor, we get seconded to various places, and I was in a new town, feeling quite lonely, away from my family, and I was really trying to push myself that it was time to get out there again and to open up my heart to a new relationship. And without many other means of meeting people, I decided to hop online, as many people do. And I was looking for a serious partner to explore having a serious relationship with, and certainly was at an age that I was ready to settle down and I guess try again at finding my soulmate.
And what attracted you initially to Paul Lambert?
Initially, I was attracted to him first and foremost because, for people who aren't familiar with the Tinder platform, there is an option to super like someone, and he actually super liked me, which at the time was very flattering. And from his account, he looked like a nice guy, he looked handsome, and I could tell he was a bit older than me, which at the time I was looking for someone a bit more mature and ready for a serious relationship too. And when we started chatting, initially I was drawn to his sense of humor. He seemed quite intelligent and could just have really, deep conversations with some substance.
Can you remember your first date?
Yeah. So because I was in Port Macquarie, he actually flew up to see me from Sydney, and we went to a restaurant in Port Macquarie and, had a nice dinner. There was live music, had a few drinks, and really just kind of talked nonstop for a couple hours, and we really were hitting it off. It was, as far as first dates go, it didn't feel awkward at all, and it just felt really right.
Often when you go on a first date with someone or you start seeing them, ex-relationships come up. Did he talk about previous relationships or what had gone wrong or anything like that?
Not so much at that time. I think when you're on a first date, you try to keep things fairly superficial. You don't want to reveal too much of your baggage too soon to scare someone away. So I think at one point, it was even, I think, after dinner, I was walking back to my car and he was walking back to where he was staying. And I think he asked me a question and it came up that I had previously been married and that I was still technically married at that point, but separated, which was something I didn't really want to bring up on a first date. And it was at that point that he told me that he had been married as well. And if anything, that was a point of similarity between us, that it was kind of like a relief at that point, like, oh, well, that's good that that's not going to be a problem because you know where I'm coming from in terms of, a relationship having not worked out the way you hoped. And we didn't really go much more into why our relationships ended at that point. It was, if anything, that seems like good news.
Yeah, absolutely. Like having that common experience, I suppose, that you kind of felt understood.
Yeah.
And what were the next few weeks like? Did you go on more dates? Were you in frequent contact? Because sometimes you can go on one date and then not hear from someone for, a few weeks or whatever it is. But did this happen quite quickly?
Absolutely. So from that point, we're doing long distance, essentially, from Port Macquarie in Sydney. But we were talking pretty much every day, kind of texting a lot. And on weekends, if I was kind of traveling down to Sydney, I would see him down there. A few times he came back up to Port to see me, particularly if I was on call at the hospital, so I had to stay in town. But things moved really quickly. I think from that early stage of, revealing some details of our past to each other and kind of feeling like we were really on the same level, we really hit it off quickly. And because for the first date, he had travelled up to Port to see me, we actually caught up the next day as well. And so it was kind of like the first date was a weekend long in a way. Yeah, so it actually moved really fast.
And were there any red flags in terms of the intensity with which he approached the relationship, or was there anything he said or did that you look back on and go, oh, that might have been a sign that something wasn't quite right?
Yeah, everything's easier in retrospect, as everyone understands. But at that time, I was so not overwhelmed. I was just so focused on the romance of it all. And in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that was a bit much pretty fast. But at the time, I was just really flattered. I had, butterflies thinking about him. It was all very exciting. And it felt really great to feel a romantic connection to someone again after I had my heart broken when my marriage fell apart. In retrospect, he, sent me flowers. He bought me gifts. When I was down in Sydney, a few times I had driven through tolls and I had gotten rid of my e-tags because I was out of Sydney, and he was like, oh, don't worry about it. I'll call up and set up a temporary pass. A few times I had stayed in a hotel in Sydney and he had actually phoned up and upgraded my room. So it was like all these really overly romantic gestures, which at the time just felt really nice. And I was just, if anything, really smitten by how much care he was taking. And he had told me several times that he recognized how hard I worked and that my profession was caring for others, and he really wanted to take care of me. And yeah, I have heard from a lot of other people who have experienced violence and coercive control in their relationships that share this common thread of really intense romance and just kind of sweeping you off your feet. And then you just don't really notice when it subtly turns to more controlling behavior, or how they can turn that on you and use, the deep details of your life they learn about you, or ways that they can charm other people into giving information about you that they can then use to their advantage.
And there'd be no reason to think that when someone is being kind to you in those early stages that there's something more sinister at play. That's also everyone gets carried away at the beginning of a relationship. That's part of how your body reacts, I suppose. So it's, completely understandable that would happen. What was the eventual trigger for you ending the relationship?
I think at a certain point it did become evident to me that he was very much more into me than I was into him. I think once some of those initial relationship butterflies wore off, I didn't feel quite ready to jump into such a serious relationship just yet. I did have some of my own issues to work through with my previous relationship, and I could tell he was very much falling in love with me, and I wasn't quite feeling the same and kind of just really wanted to pump the brakes. And it was at that time probably that I was starting to get a bit overwhelmed with the level of intensity he was showing towards me. So initially it was essentially a matter of, look, I'm sorry, but I think while I was very excited about this relationship and I know it's, going really fast and, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the relationship, but I just don't actually think it's right for me.
Did you say that over the phone or in person?
No, so I waited until we were seeing each other face to face, and he became very upset and was crying and, telling me that I was scared and that I hadn't given him a chance. And I tried to stick to my guns, but then he, kept calling me and saying how upset he was. And I felt really guilty, and I thought that maybe I was just scared and that I hadn't given him a chance. So at that point said, okay, let's give it another try. And I guess each time I tried to end the relationship, the behavior kept escalating. So the next time I tried to end the relationship, first of all, we had a conversation again. I was down in Sydney, and it wasn't until after I had kind of gone back home and we were chatting on the phone that I thought we'd had a very adult conversation about, yep, this is done. But then I was like, oh, no, like, what? Like, I thought we were giving it another try, and we kind of kept going around in circles, and then we were back on again. And then, next time we had a conversation about it, it then started turning into threats of suicide. I had driven away from his house, and then he called me saying that he was wandering the streets. He was going to jump in front of a bus. So I went back to his house. I ended up sleeping with him, which I didn't want to. And the threats of suicide then continued and became more intense. And he just kept finding a way to get his way back in. And it was a night that I actually was at a high school reunion that we were planning to go together, and he had booked a hotel room for. And after lots of conversations and, again, more threats of harming himself, we kind of got to this agreement that was like, fine, okay, let's go to this together, but then we're still not together, and then after this we're done. And it was at that evening when I had some friends with me that I'd had a few drinks, and it basically all came out that I was just really trying to get away from this guy, but didn't know how, and I didn't want him to hurt himself, but I just also felt really trapped. And it was with the help of my friends that I finally kind of physically got away from him. And then I opened up to my sister about what had been happening. And she actually encouraged me to go to the local police station and have a chat to them, because I was, from that point, going back up to Port Macquarie for work that week. And, he knew where I lived, and I lived alone. And I was just feeling a bit nervous about it, just because of, I guess, his escalation and his behavior, although at that point he hadn't made any direct threats to harm me.
What was the advice from the police when you spoke to them?
So the initial advice from police, they looked up his records, and they said that he looked like he was more harm to himself than anyone else, and that in the context of someone trying to harm themselves and you're worried that, you can call police and say, look, I know this guy who's threatening to harm himself, and that they can actually then follow that up. So that was kind of good for me to feel like I had something to do other than just take him back, that I could kind of refer that problem to someone else. And they also said, look, I know it might be awkward, but when you get home, let your neighbours know what's going on, because they actually made a comment along the lines of, we don't want you kind of stuck in your house with no one knowing you're missing, which at the time I didn't really think anything of it. But then I did start thinking about that in the ensuing days, and it did start to make me feel really scared about what all this meant. And then I felt really good just actually opening up to someone about the situation I was in. And the constable that I saw was really lovely and really took everything seriously. And I just felt really heard at the time, which I found a very empowering experience.
And he didn't let it go at that point, did he? So you've broken off the relationship. You're, going elsewhere as clearly as you can, and he was still persisting. He showed up to your sister's house or something, didn't he?
Yeah, so that was actually the night before going to the police. So he had a few of my things. So he showed up to my sister's house, which he had only been to once before, and dropped off some things, and we told him to leave, and my brother-in-law was there as well. But that night he kept calling me, and it was, for that reason as well that my sister encouraged me to speak to police. And when I did return to Port Macquarie after seeing the police, he was waiting for me there. And that's when I basically said, look, you need to get your things and leave. Don't contact me again. I don't want to hear from you. And after that point, that's when he started calling and texting me, telling me I wasn't safe in my house and that he had stolen some of my keys when I hadn't noticed. And of course, then that is when I called police again and went to my neighbor's house, actually, because I was really scared. And from that point, because he had sent me threatening text messages, the police filed for a domestic violence order, and my mum came up to stay with me for a few days, and then I started staying with a cousin.
When did you find out about his history and what he'd done in the past?
So he alluded to some things kind of in the weeks prior, that he had had some problems with a few of his exes and that he was technically on parole and wasn't supposed to be in New South Wales at all, and kind of used that to also manipulate me, because he said, if I go to the hospital to seek help for my mental health with my suicidal ideation, that will be in breach of my parole, or that, if you call the police or if you speak to anyone, I could get into trouble. So that was a way of manipulating me and certainly kind of played on my sympathies. And it wasn't until he started threatening me that he started telling me that, I've stalked women before, I won't let things go, there's a side of me I can't control. And obviously that really freaked me out. And it wasn't until really after all of this happened that I found out just how significant his past history was.
Eventually, you were going to have to return home because that's where all your things are. And I imagine that time passes and you would start to think, surely he's moved on. And I think what we do to ourselves is say, I'm overreacting. I've got too caught up in my head. I'm sure I'm being ridiculous. So eventually, of course, you did go back home. It was to pick up some laundry or something, wasn't it? Like you had a few things to do?
Yeah, so at that point, my mum had stayed with me for a few days, but then returned back to her home, and I was staying with my second cousin in town. But I had been on call at the hospital the night before, so I'd been in and out of work, and I'd only packed a few things when I left my house when I initially went to her place. So I needed some clean clothes, essentially, and I did and still have a cat, so I had to go and make sure that he was fed. And at that point, because I had blocked his number and social media and I hadn't heard anything more from police, I kind of assumed that everything was taken care of and that, he probably would just be moving on, and I was just being a bit overly paranoid. In the kind of week leading up to it, I was in a bit of a habit that anytime I did duck home quickly, I would do a full sweep of the house and kind of check behind every nook and cranny. And I had hidden a few knives in my bedside table, and I had asked my landlord to change the locks, but in the meantime I had removed a few door handles, tried to make it I felt it made me feel safer. But that day I think I was just overly tired from work, and it was still daylight out, so I kind of just felt a bit safe, and I think I was just exhausted from everything. And instead, just once I got home, I was like, oh, I'm going to have dinner. So I had some dinner, watched a bit of telly, and then it was starting to get dark, so I figured I should probably go grab the things I came here to get, and walked to the back of the house where my bedroom was, and that's when he jumped out from one of my closets and restrained me.
Can you remember how that even felt? Like, I imagine that the incredible shock and the fear, and I mean that invasion of privacy and the fact you were just in your house doing what anyone does in their house, assuming that they're alone and someone else is there. Can you remember at all what went through your head during that attack?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to think about it, obviously, but my initial thought when he jumped out was that, oh my God, I wasn't crazy. He's actually come for me. This was my worst fear, and it's actually happening, and it really felt surreal. And my initial thought was that, he's going to kill me.
Mm. And he stabbed you 11 times and doused you in petrol. How did you manage to escape?
I think just the intensity of the flight or fight response is what really had my back. And I don't know, I think I have so many hopes and dreams for my future, and all I think about the whole time since, from the moment I saw him until I got away was just like, I've got to get away. But to be honest, I think ultimately I got away because I was lucky, and so many things could have been slightly differently, and it wouldn't have ended that way, just like it doesn't end with a happy ending for so many other people. But I think ultimately the petrol, it was just terrifying. And I think at that point my push to get him off me just became frantic. And I think because I was a bit slippery with petrol all over me, I was able just to get out of his grasp and just make a run for it.
And what happened when police eventually arrived? Because you ran out and got the attention of neighbours, who I imagine would have heard screaming and what was going on next door. What happened when police eventually arrived?
So when I got to my neighbours were waiting for me, which, is such a blessing. And I think at that point I just was still so convinced that I was going to bleed to death that I was a bit frantic, and I think part of me went into work mode and I started just bossing everyone around. My initial thought when police arrived, because they arrived first, was, why are you here? I need an ambulance. And I was actually a bit annoyed that they were there instead of an ambulance. But of course they come on the scene first to make sure that everything's safe for the emergency responders, and I get it. Mm. But yeah, I knew that they were around and they asked me a few questions, but to be honest, I was so focused on my own survival at that point and so frantically terrified that I was going to bleed to death that I didn't take much note of them from that point.
And how do you even begin to recover from something like that? How many people do we know who have met their husbands on a dating app or, in lots of different ways? What were the months afterwards like in terms of trying to overcome that and, as a young woman trying to start your life again?
Mm. It was really hard, and it still is hard sometimes. Initially, the first thing was that I was in a hospital that I worked at, so I felt really safe, and I was surrounded by my colleagues who were also looking after me as my doctors and nurses. And I think that was, step one was just feeling really safe and well cared for. Also is that I was told while I was still in a resus bay in the emergency department that the police came to see me, took a statement at that point and told me that he had been shot dead by police in the pursuit, which was such a huge relief. And I think they were a bit nervous to tell me because I would feel guilty, but at that point, and I still feel horrible kind of saying it, but I just was so relieved. And
it's the only way you would have felt safe.
Yeah. So I think that was really helpful for me obviously, because, so many people don't have that luxury that then they can start the recovery knowing that they can't be hurt again by that person. But having said that, first there was, the physical recovery. I had lost a lot of blood and just needed a lot of rest and needed to strengthen particularly my legs and my hand again, and needed some ongoing physiotherapy and hand therapy. From the mental side of things, it was really weird because initially I really felt like, and still sometimes do feel like, a part of me died, and that I was kind of witnessing the aftermath of my own death and, hearing from people I hadn't heard from in years and getting all these well wishes and everyone saying really nice, flattering things about me, which is great. But it just felt really weird because it felt like stuff someone would say to you or to your family after you died. That I took a month off work, and that it was a bit of a blur now when I think about it, because it was just a lot of just feeling a bit lost and broken and sad. But then I guess going back to work was probably one of the best things for me at that point, because it really allowed me to get a sense of my power and my worth back. Kind of once my legs and hand had healed enough to kind of do my job, it felt really good to feel useful again. And, I do get a lot of joy from what I do. So that really helped. And having the privilege of looking after people when they're in such a vulnerable moment of their lives gave me strength as well, and really drove me on and continues to drive me forward. But of course, the psychological aspect is the bit that I still struggle with. And one thing that's vitally important, I think, is getting professional help. So I, of course, have over the years seen a great psychologist with specialized training in managing trauma, and great GP. I also take regular medication, which I feel good on and I'm not ashamed of. And just, I'm really so grateful and lucky that I have such a fantastic support network of amazing friends, family, and I've got, incredible colleagues that are like family as well, that have really stood by me and helped me through things, even when I should be, in my mind, back to normal, and I'm not.
What's it like to then try and date again? Because your trust would have been so broken. I can't imagine, and I know you work with women, so I'm imagining that might make you feel a little safer. But that long-standing trauma, I just imagine that would be really, really difficult. How did you find that to try and, meet people again?
Yeah, it's tough. I still struggle sometimes to even make eye contact with men. And I certainly never was able to put myself out there like I had before. I was really lucky that I met my now fiance Ben at work. He is an orthopedic doctor, so we literally met in the corridors in the hospital when we were both working in Coffs Harbour. And it was just lucky that there was a group of us that all hung out socially after work, so we became friends first, and then from there it turned into a relationship. And I think being able to have someone that my other friends and colleagues also knew and also thought was a good guy, and there may or may not have been illegal background checks performed. But yeah, I think if it hadn't happened in that way, that I just happened to make a new friend who was also a mutual friend of mine, that then kind of a relationship blossomed from that. I honestly don't know how I would have ever gone into the dating scene of going on blind dates or trying to strike up a conversation with someone in a bar or, in any kind of setting, because even, I work with women and, obviously they have male partners sometimes, and I obviously have male colleagues and do interact with men in my day-to-day life, but it takes me a bit to actually trust. And certainly I have so much respect for anyone who has been through a violent relationship and finds love again, because it is tough. But I guess, I'm really happy now, and I know that it gives other people hope to hear there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I guess it is possible, and I do like to be an optimist. So part of me also tries to see the good in people and to trust that most people are going to live up to your positive expectations.
Speaking of background checks, how was it that when you went to police and raised your concerns about this person and they had a history of this type of behaviour, that wasn't put together? Why was it that you were left in quite a vulnerable state given this man's history?
I think at the time, most of it was due to the fact that most of his previous offences, or maybe all of his previous offences, I'm not sure, were in a different state or in fact overseas. So I think it probably wasn't anything at the fault of the police officers that I saw. I think it was just potentially information that wasn't available to them, or, privacy laws protected. To my understanding, some information needs to be requested, and I guess I would assume it's similar to medical records, that you can't just willy-nilly access anyone's medical record because there's confidentiality laws. So I think it might be similar, that you would need to put through a formal request to get certain information. And I think since my attack, there has been some legislation changes to allow a bit more freedom of sharing information state to state between police. But I think it was a case of the bureaucracy and different state governments, different policing, that I was let down.
Finally, I wanted to ask you, after your experience and the work you do in this field, what would you like women to know? Are there certain red flags that you look back on that you think, I wish I'd known more about coercive control or the progress of violence, like I know you've spoken about, and this is something that comes up a lot, that just because someone hasn't been physically violent doesn't mean that can't escalate very, very fast. What is it that you want women to know?
I certainly want women to know that there's always help available, and that no matter what sort of situation you find yourself in, even if you've tried to open up to someone and you've been shut down, that other people will believe you and will help you. And there's lots of fantastic formal support services available, as well as, opening up to, a friend, your hairdresser, your doctor, whoever you feel comfortable opening up to about any sort of concern you may have. If you tell the right person, you will get help. I guess also trust your gut. We're taught as girls that we're going to be swept off our feet one day by, now the man or woman or otherwise who is right for you. And, if things are moving really fast, ask yourself why. And it might just be romance and it might be right, and that's fine. But if you start feeling uncomfortable about anything, make sure you let your boundaries be known. Learn about consent, particularly when we're engaging in sex with each other. It needs to be a yes and not like a, convince me and then okay. If someone is threatening to harm themselves or is telling you who you can or can't talk to, just little things like that we think, it's okay for a guy to be jealous. It just means they care, or
he must just love me so much that he can't live without me.
Yeah, not really. That behavior's not okay and could lead to something more. If he or she can't respect your boundaries in that respect, that, maybe it's time to move on. Having said that, though, I guess the biggest thing I want people to understand is that overall, it's not about you being silly or not realizing the red flags or you are at fault for this. If you ever experience violence in any way, it's not your fault. And, that is why this happens, is because the perpetrators are good at it. Like, they're good at controlling, they're good at charming. And don't ever feel like, I really felt like, I'd gotten myself into this mess and it's my responsibility to get myself out. And that is not the case. If you find yourself feeling uncomfortable about something, it's not because you're an idiot. It's because someone's been very good at controlling you, and it's okay to ask for help. And as a society, we can all do our part to make it not okay for that kind of behavior to continue in future. And it's not just about women, but about men and children as well, that a lot of this kind of stuff that we see with particularly violence against women all comes down to gender inequity. And we need to be comfortable both in encouraging women to be independent and strong and in control of their own bodies, but also encouraging men and boys to show emotion, and it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay if you want to be, the primary carer of your children, and it's okay to cry. And I think as a community, if we can all do our part to really reflect on what kind of unconscious biases we may have in relation to gender and how we use language, we can all do our bit to shift the cultural expectations and attitudes about violence as a whole as well.
Absolutely. And your story, I think, is so important because the images of him, and I've been on dating apps, and I think, as I said, so many people are meeting their partners there. This isn't a monster. This, as in, you would look at that image and think that's just an ordinary person. That's not how we imagine, violent men to look. And that, to me, is such an enormous lesson.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it could be anyone. And that's why it's so important to trust our guts.
Yeah, I think we really need to break this notion that, women or men choose abusive, violent partners. Not at all. Obviously, nobody chooses to be with someone that treats them terribly. It's that we actually are all looking for a really nice, wonderful partner, and sometimes things don't turn out the way we hoped. And one day you just wake up and think, gosh, I'm going crazy, and how did I end up here? What did I do wrong?
And that's part of relationships is vulnerability, and sometimes it's worth it, and then other times there's manipulation, which is what happened here. And I think it's a story that so many women can relate with. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Dr. Angela Jay will be speaking at this year's virtual TEDx Sydney event, taking place on Friday, November the 6th. You can find a link to the event in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our producer is Lem Zakaria, and our executive producer is Zoe Ferguson. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join. If this episode has brought anything up for you, then you can always call 1-800-RESPECT. That's 1-800-737-732. Or if you're ever in immediate danger, call 000.
Ever wanted someone to explain what's really going on in the news? Not just give you the latest, assuming you know the whole backstory? Well, welcome to The Quickie, a daily news podcast that gives you a rundown on what's happening in the world right now, then jumps into a story in more depth, so you know the hows, whys and wheres of it all. Cut through all the noise and listen whenever you want, not just at the top of every hour. The Quickie, getting you up to speed daily.